Big Men Fear Me: The Fast Life and Quick Death of Canada's Most Powerful Media Mogul. Written by Mark Bourrie. Read for you by Tom Lute. Published by Biblioasis in Windsor, Ontario. Epigraph. There are newspaper publishers and editors in this country, apparently, who think that the freedom of the press was won for the sake of the press. Well, it wasn't. The freedom of the press was won for the sake of the people, and if the newspapers of this country are not prepared now to put aside party considerations and fight for that greater thing, the freedom of the individual, freedom for the ordinary man, then the day will come when the ordinary man will not fight for freedom of the press. Grattan O'Leary, 1937. Dedication. For Cam. Introduction. The Forgotten Man. This is a book about a man who many people, including those at the center of economic and political power, expected to be Prime Minister of Canada. Instead, he died mysteriously when he was just 47 years old. You've probably never heard of George McCullagh, because he's been deliberately erased from Canada's history. Toronto columnist Robert Fulford called his biography one of the great unwritten books in Canadian history. Well, here's his biography. It will be up to you to decide whether it's great. So, who was George McCullagh, and why should you care about him? George McCullagh was a media rock star. He was the most powerful and dynamic man in Canadian publishing. He was also a giant in the nation's sports world. He was co-owner of the Toronto Maple Leafs and Toronto Argonauts, and had one of the best horse race stables in Canada. McCullagh moved easily among the elites of the Western world, and though seen as a flawed man by those at the very top of Anglosphere governments, was feared and respected. A poor boy from London, Ontario, who dropped out of school in grade 9, McCullagh founded the Globe and Mail in the depth of the Great Depression, when he was just 31 years old. The Globe and the Mail and Empire had been around for decades before McCullagh came on the scene, but they were moribund newspapers that were dying of bad management. He hammered them together and made them the country's most powerful political newspaper. And he deliberately gave the paper its strange name because its initials were, still are, GM, the same as his own. McCullagh worked his way up from nothing by hiking the back roads of rural Ontario, selling newspapers during the terrible recession that followed the end of the First World War and the 1918 flu pandemic. While he rose from those dusty roads to a reporting job in the newsroom of the Globe, he dragged his own ball and chain. As a young man, he was an alcoholic. Booze masked the fact that he was also bipolar, and that turned out to be the thing that stopped him from becoming a national politician. In the end, it was probably mental illness that killed him. McCullagh, with the help of William Wright, Canada's richest man and a most bizarre multimillionaire, became a force in national politics. He advocated for one-party government in Ottawa and at Queen's Park. And, for a while, he tried to convince Ontario's leaders to ditch democracy, because partisanship got in the way of decision-making when Canada was struggling through an economic crisis. He used his media platform, his newspaper and airtime that he bought on radio stations across Canada, to start a national right-of-center anti-democratic populist movement that peaked just before the Second World War. And when that war came, he fought news censorship, drove wedges that helped divide Canada when the country needed unity to fight Hitler, and helped make his best friend the Premier of Ontario. When the war ended, he toured Europe and fired up hatred of the Soviets. Then he bought the Toronto Telegram and was the leader in Canada's greatest newspaper war. McCullagh had a giant personality. Handsome, smart, funny, emotional, generous, and graced with tremendous social skills, he made friends among the elites of Canada, the United States, and Great Britain. He built an estate on the north end of Toronto that was home to some of Canada's best racehorses and show horses. But when things were going well, he would be struck down by depression and would sneak off to New York to see his psychiatrist. Dr. Robert
Sample complete. Ready to continue?